Aquatic ecology notes. This is video 1 of 3. So we're going to start with just the basic definition of aquatic versus marine. So an aquatic ecosystem is all of it in general refers to all water, but specifically will refer to just freshwater ecosystems. And then when you're referring to a marine ecosystem, it will refer to only saltwater ecosystems. So essentially marine is the ocean and aquatic is inland stuff. So now we're going to start talking about, we're going to categorize the critters that live in both aquatic and marine ecosystems and kind of put them into different groups for you guys to discuss in general. So the first group is a plankton group. And there are two options. There's a phytoplankton and a zooplankton. So a phytoplankton is a plant plankton. Phyto is plant. Plankton itself means drifter. So these are all critters that cannot swim against a current. So they're just kind of drifting around. The phytoplankton are primary producers. So they're making all the food. And these are the plants in the ocean, especially out in the open ocean where there's no actual, able to be like a seaweed or anything, because there's nothing for them to attach to. So you have to have this drifting stuff. Incredibly important as far as the marine ecosystem goes. They're usually very small, single cell for many of them, or just a few cells. You're looking at a lot of different types of algae and cyanobacteria, and they actually account, phytoplankton, for 75% of the oxygen in our atmosphere. So incredibly important as far as the whole global ecosystem goes. They're also incredibly important because they're the base of the food chain. So really, really important in most marine ecosystems as that base of the food chain. Almost everything eats them. So then the opposite of the phytoplankton is the zooplankton. And the zooplankton are the animal plankton. And the animal plankton are also drifters, same thing. But these are just a little bit bigger, usually a little bit more complex than a phytoplankton, more than single cell, but these tend to be pretty small still. You can have zooplankton that's an herbivore that feeds on the phytoplankton, or you can have a carnivorous zooplankton that feeds on other zooplankton. Again, base of the food chain is the plankton. So the zooplankton is a stock for the larger critters like whales and fish. So most of those animals are eating the zooplankton. So really, really important. You hear a lot about the whales eating the krill. This is a picture of the krill here. Plankton, it's important to remember it's a group of critters. So they come from a lot of different types of invertebrates. You can have this krill that's related to shrimp. You can have crustaceans. You can have small fish. Jellyfish is a big one. So plankton don't have to be small. The technical term is a drifter. So anything that floats along with the current that doesn't have the ability to swim against a current is a plankton. So they can be potentially really big. The other big thing to know for zooplankton is that they are larval forms, a lot of it. So almost every animal, almost every invertebrate and fish in the ocean, all of the crab, lobster, all of the shrimp, all of the bivalves, all the fish, all of those reproduce and lay eggs, and those eggs float around as plankton for a while. The little tiny critters float around as plankton for a while, and then once they get big enough to swim against a current, they settle down into the adult lifestyle. It's very different. So they act as zooplankton for a long time and then turn into the big animals. So the larval form is really important in the zooplankton. Your other two options are the nekton and the benthic. 10 minutes?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Okay. So the nekton are the bigger critters. You can have, these are critters that swim against a current. These are the top producing animals in the environment. So the whales, the fish, the turtles, the dolphins, all that kind of stuff. Go ahead and write on it. And they are the ones, right on it. They're the ones that eat the plankton. They're the ones that swim around in the water column. So what you also hear a lot for the nekton is a pelagic animal. If it's swimming in the water column anywhere, it is a pelagic animal. And then the benthic critters are the bottom dwelling critters. This is all the barnacles, oysters, lobsters, crabs, stuff like that. All the bivalves like clams and mussels. These tend to be primary consumers and decomposers. They tend to be, well, they're hanging out on the ocean floor. So they have to be, you know, some of the more basic stuff. Tends to be mostly inverts, but you can find some fish. An example of a benthic fish would be a flounder. A lot of these are also filter feeders. You see a lot of filter feeders eating plankton in this benthic stuff. So something like a clam or an oyster would be a filter feeder, stuff like that. Okay, so moving into freshwater ecosystems, we're going to talk about all the aquatic stuff first, and then we'll do the marine stuff in the next video. So the aquatic stuff, we're going to start with moving water ecosystems. And the moving water ecosystem is like a river. So we can't really talk about a river based on just a river, because usually rivers are so big that they cover more than one ecosystem. So we end up having a river that covers, because it's so long, you know, goes through thousands and thousands of miles, sometimes across country, everything like that, goes into a lot of different ecosystems. So we're going to actually talk about a river based on upstream versus downstream. So you're upstream, at the top of a river, you have a lot of characteristics that you need to think about, and you may wish to kind of diagram this out to help yourself. So as we start in a river, as we start upstream, once my computer works, okay, as we start upstream, we have cold water. Temperature is normally cold. We have very clear. There's not a lot of sediment in it. Very high velocity. The water is moving very quickly, so you tend to have a lot of waterfalls and rapids. Lots of oxygen, so this moving water accounts for the rest of this stuff. Lots of oxygen, clear water. You're going to see very low nutrients on this in upstream stuff, because it's all getting swept downstream and moved away. As far as animals go, you'll see relatively low biodiversity. There's stuff there, but not a lot of it. So you see fish like trout, you see some inverts that are able, they have to be really well adapted to hanging on to something in the current, in the moving water. So upstream river gets its energy from gravity. You have to start somewhere. So it starts up in the mountains, high up. Every single river everywhere in the world has to get its energy from gravity. That's where it all comes from. So they start up high, they move really fast. As they move down the mountain, they're picking up a lot of energy, picking up sediments, and so this is the upstream characteristic. Then, as you move further down along the river, the downstream characteristics are pretty much the opposite of that. So now we're slowing down. The water movement itself is slower. Because the water is moving slower, it's less oxygen. It's more algae and cyanobacteria, more plants. It is, because we're out of the mountains, it's a warmer temperature. There are more nutrients. There are more sediments in the water. And there's also higher biodiversity. You'll see a lot more fish species. You'll see a lot more invert species that are all can hang out, and then even some mammals. And the big thing about all aquatic ecosystems is that you have this terrestrial component where you have the aquatic critters, the fish and the inverts, the clams and the mussels and everything, but you also have the terrestrial stuff like a deer or a bear or a moose or stuff like that that comes in and feeds off stuff in the water, comes in and impacts that aquatic ecosystem even though it's technically a terrestrial animal. So talking about standing water ecosystems, this is going to be the lakes and ponds. Same thing goes with them. So now the lakes and ponds, you have a couple different zones. You have a littoral zone, and that's the shallow stuff near the shore. And you have a couple characteristics for this one. You have plants in here because it's shallow, because there's sunlight. So this will only extend down to where the sunlight ends. Relatively high biodiversity because there's all this stuff there. Frogs, snails, insects, fish, all that kind of stuff. So this is all the stuff at the outside of the lake, along the shore, where you see a lot of the life. And then the opposite of that would be the limnetic zone. And so now you're going out way offshore on these bigger lakes, where you have surface water still penetrated by sunlight, but you don't have the plants other than the floating plants. So all of the shore plants that have to be rooted into the sediment are gone because we're too far offshore for that, which is too deep. So this is the surface. So if you're looking at the side of a lake, hang on, let me go back. I'll show you that in the next slide. So limnetic is all of this surface stuff. And then the last one is the profundal zone, and that's the deep open water, too dark for photosynthesis. So if you're looking at the side, like a side view of a lake, you have here, you have on either side, all the way around, circular-ish lake, you have the littoral zone, all the way around. And then in the middle, at the top, you have the limnetic zone. That's where up, down until the sunlight penetrates. And then below that, you have the profundal zone. So you're going to see most of the biodiversity here near shore, where you see lots more plants and lots more animals. But you also see a relatively high amount of biodiversity here, where you have sunlight still, you have algae, and then all the fish eating that algae and eating that plankton. And then you go down into the profundal, where there's not that much there. Okay, so thermal stratification is a really big concept. You guys did your layered ocean lab over this, so I kind of I kind of did that on purpose and let you kind of struggle with it a little bit at first to try to really think about the concepts. And so now let's do the notes on the concepts. And you have this concept where in a lake and in the ocean as well, but since we're focusing on aquatic ecosystems for right now, you have this, if you graph it, you start out with warm water near the surface, and it goes down to cold water at the ocean floor. So you have essentially two layers in a lake or in an ocean. And you have this really drastic change right here where the temperature drops off really fast. That's the thermocline. So you see this all over the place. And a lot of the times you'll see a really shallow thermocline, and then you'll see a much bigger one deeper down. So if you guys have ever jumped into a lake and seen like your feet are really cold, but your head and shoulders are fine, that's the thermocline. So the causes for that is that you get this changing with seasons. So you have warm summer air, it heats up the surface, it's less dense, they float above the cold water, and you don't have anything to mix it. So without a storm or a hurricane or waves or anything like that to mix these layers, they end up staying like this for a long, long time. So if you had set up those good columns, and if we have time we can set one up, you can leave it. I've left it and it stayed for over a year without any mixing. So that thermocline, like I said, is the barrier between warm and cold water, that drastic change in temperature, and it prevents the mixing, keeps the nutrients down here and the dissolved oxygen up here for the most part. The fall turnover is when that changes. So it happens a couple times a year in the natural environment. Temperatures begin to drop, surface layer is more dense, sinks to the bottom, and that mixes stuff. So this is incredibly important. We know, thinking back to where I said that plankton is bottom of the food chain, is really, really important. Plankton, the plant plankton, is the base of the food chain. The plant plankton, it photosynthesizes. So we know that it needs sunlight, and we know that it needs nutrients in order to do some nice photosynthesis and make lots of energy. So what happens is it's got the sunlight because it's at the surface. But once the mixing brings up the nutrients, once those layers are dissolved, that happens in the fall and the spring, brings up the nutrients. So now all of a sudden you've got plenty of sunlight and you've got plenty of nutrients, which used to be the destructive factor, used to be the thing that slowed them down, the limiting factor. So now you have plenty of this, and so now the plankton goes crazy, and you end up with a huge increase in the plankton population, which drives the whole base of the food chain. So you have this bloom, this plankton bloom, in the fall and again in the spring when this mixing turnover happens. And the same thing in the spring. So this slide just explains the the spring turnover. So it's the same thing. Twice a year you have this big mixing of the water layers, and so that brings up nutrients. The nutrients feed the plankton goes crazy, which makes all the critters happy. So you'll end up seeing a lot of the times that many critters will time it so that they're reproducing right at the beginning of this turnover, so that when their offspring are born and hatch, they're swimming around as zooplankton, and the zooplankton have plenty of plant plankton to eat. And so that drives just a whole bunch of stuff. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is the wetlands, freshwater wetlands. So you have a couple options here. A marsh is, all wetlands are determined by the type of plant life. So a marsh is determined by grass. So you see a marsh, you see all of the grass. A saltwater marsh is the one, like as you're driving to Galveston, you see all this grass stuff. That's a saltwater marsh. So specifically to freshwater wetlands, it's often flooded, usually around a river or a lake. You have to have that water coming from somewhere. It can be very seasonal. The Okavango is a really cool one to look up in Africa. Floods once a year in the rainy season and just turns everything, like, it's beautiful. So a wetland, you have to have flooding, temporary or permanent. Ground is waterlogged, not a lot of water movement, even less than a lake, very relatively shallow, but tons and tons, huge biodiversity. All wetlands, incredibly big biodiversity. They tend to act as nursery habitats because there's lots of food, there's lots of shelter, a little bit milder weather usually, and so really important ecosystems. Swamps are a different type of wetland, and they're lower down to the ground. Their dominant plant life is trees. So remember I said it's a plant life that determines what type of wetland you see, so it's the trees that are really important in a swamp. This would be what you would see a lot in like Louisiana, Kentucky, stuff like that. You see the swamps. Tends to be permanently covered by water as opposed to just flooded. Still very relatively shallow water, but you see a lot more of the reptiles and amphibians. You see a lot more. Birds are very common in wetlands, so lower biodiversity than a marsh, but still plenty there. And then you have this hardwood bottomland forest is another type of ecosystem, and this is where you really have, it's trees. It's different trees, like you would see a cypress and stuff in a swamp, but here you would see the hardwood trees like oaks, and the ground tends to be soaked with water, but not necessarily any standing water. And that tends to be right around a river or stream as well. So these trees can't tolerate as much water, so they have to have just a little bit less of the flooding and more just of the standing water. The prairie potholes are depressions that hold water out on a prairie. Big surprise. Very common in the subarctic and temperate zones, like up in Canada. This is a great bird habitat, especially ducks. They really love these. You obviously aren't going to see a lot of fish in this because they're just these little tiny things out on a prairie, but you will see tons of invertebrates and then tons of birds eating the invertebrates or eating the plants in the prairie. The peat bog or peat moss bog. Peat is a specific type of soil that is up to 20% organic. So you have this, again, this is in a colder climate, and you would see where the grass, it freezes. So you have this grass growth in the summer, and then the winter comes, the grass dies, but it freezes before it can break down all the way. So you have this soil that's really very thick and heavy, a lot of organic material. They actually still burn this in Ireland instead of wood, because Ireland and Scotland don't have a lot of forests, so they end up using the peat moss, the peat soil as fuel. Ends up preserving, you can see the picture of this probably 2,000 to 3,000 year old, I can't remember the date on this one specifically, but it ends up preserving species or human remains, animal remains really well, so it gives us a really good look into early human life and the settlers that were there at that time. And again, the ground tends to be waterlogged as opposed to standing water. Relatively low biodiversity in these. So the importance of wetlands: they have to filter and purify water. They are a nursery habitat, and they are very high biodiversity. So really, really incredibly important as far as wetland ecosystems for all of these animals. The filtering thing is really important. They tend to take all the water coming from rivers, coming from lakes, and filter it and act just like a sponge and soak up all the bad stuff before it hits the ocean. So again, because a lot of the coastal ones become so important as filters. So because of all that, there's a big movement right now to protect natural wetland environments. We're doing that with the HIP to Habitat program, where we're trying to restore the Galveston salt marsh wetlands. Congress wants to revise the definition of wetlands. So this is kind of a bad thing, because if you're a developer or farmer, you want to develop that. You have all this open land. They want to drain it. They want to put up stuff. They want to develop it. So Congress, in order to make that money and to use that land, wants to change the definition so that they can't be protected, and that so that would the worth there for the water quality for the wetlands there is about $1.6 billion. We'd spend $7.5 to $31 billion more a year in the flood control costs if we drain all that and get rid of that flood control. So this is a very controversial subject right now. Kind of depends on where you fall with this. The farmers say they need the land in order to make money. The protectionists, conservationists say, no, you need to keep that. There's tons and tons of endangered species, and the nursery habitat is too important to lose. And I think we are going to stop.